November 12, 1943. 0347 hours. 200 feet beneath the surface of the Philippine Sea, 40 nautical miles east of Leyte Gulf. The USS Wahoo, fleet submarine S-238, lies motionless in the dark water, her diesel engine silent, her electric motors disengaged, her crew frozen at their stations like statues in a tomb. Inside the pressure hull, the air is thick and stale, heavy with the smell of unwashed bodies, diesel fuel, battery acid, and the metallic tang of recycled oxygen. The temperature hovers near 90 degrees despite the depth, and sweat drips from every surface, every face, every exposed pipe and valve. In the control room, Commander Dudley Mush Morton stands beside the plotting table, one hand resting on the cool steel surface, the other holding a stopwatch. He does not move. He does not speak. Around him, 79 men barely breathe, each one aware that the slightest sound, a dropped wrench, a cough, a footfall on the deck plates, could betray their position to the Japanese destroyer circling overhead. Through the hull comes the sound that submariners fear most. The rhythmic ping of active sonar, a sharp metallic echo that penetrates steel and water, searching, probing, hunting. Ping. 15 seconds. Ping. The destroyer is close, perhaps 300 yards, moving in a slow search pattern. The sonar operator, his headphones pressed tight against his ears, holds up one finger, then points upward. Contact directly overhead. Morton nods but does not speak. The Wahoo has been running silent for 6 hours, drifting with the current, every non-essential system shut down to eliminate noise. The crew has been trained for this. They have practiced the drill dozens of times in Pearl Harbor, in the training tanks off San Diego, in the deep water west of Midway. But this is not practice. This is the third time in as many days that a Japanese escort has forced them deep, and Morton knows that his luck, his skill, and his submarine's battery charge are all running out. But he also knows something the Japanese do not. He knows that the Wahoo has perfected a technique, an innovation born of desperation and refined through trial and error, that allows her to remain undetected longer than any other submarine in the Pacific Fleet. And in 72 hours, that technique will allow the Wahoo to sink 4 Japanese convoys, 21 ships totaling more than 80,000 tons, and vanish into the depths before the enemy understands what has happened. The submarine war in the Pacific between 1941 and 1945 was a campaign of extraordinary violence and technical sophistication, fought in 3 dimensions across millions of square miles of ocean. American submarines, operating from bases in Pearl Harbor, Australia, and later the Philippines, targeted Japanese merchant shipping in a systematic effort to strangle Japan's war economy. Japan was an island nation entirely dependent on imported resources: oil from the Dutch East Indies, iron ore from Malaya, rice from Indochina, coal from Manchuria. Without a steady flow of cargo ships and tankers to transport these materials to the home islands, Japanese industry would collapse and the military machine would grind to a halt. American war planners understood this vulnerability and deployed their submarine force as a strategic weapon, a silent blockade that operated far from the headlines but struck at the heart of Japan's ability to wage war. By the end of the conflict, American submarines had sunk 1,314 Japanese merchant ships totaling 5.3 million tons, along with 214 warships including 1 battleship, 8 aircraft carriers, and 11 cruisers. No other branch of the American military achieved such a decisive strategic impact with so small a force. But in 1943, the submarine campaign was still finding its rhythm, still overcoming the technical and tactical problems that had plagued it since Pearl Harbor. And one of those problems was the deadly game of cat and mouse played between submerged submarines and Japanese anti-submarine warfare forces. The Japanese convoy system evolved rapidly after early disastrous losses. By 1943, merchant ships sailed in organized groups protected by dedicated escort vessels, destroyers, destroyer escorts, and corvettes equipped with depth charges, sonar, and increasingly sophisticated detection techniques. When a submarine attacked a convoy, the escorts would counterattack immediately, forcing the submarine deep and hunting it with sonar. The standard American response was to dive below 300 feet, shut down all non-essential machinery, and run silent, creeping along at minimal speed on electric motors, hoping to evade detection until the escorts gave up and moved on. But the Japanese were persistent. Their sonar, while not as advanced as Allied systems, was effective at close range. Their depth charges, dropped in patterns designed to saturate an area, could damage or destroy a submarine even without a direct hit. And they had time. A submerged submarine running on batteries could remain underwater for only a limited period before it had to surface to recharge. If the escorts could maintain contact long enough, they could force the submarine to the surface where it would be destroyed by gunfire. American submarines needed an edge, a technique that would allow them to evade detection, preserve battery power, and position themselves for follow-up attacks. The USS Wahoo, under Commander Dudley Morton, developed that technique. Morton was not a conventional submarine commander. He was aggressive, unconventional, willing to take risks that more cautious officers avoided. He had assumed command of the Wahoo in January 1943 and immediately implemented changes that transformed the boat's effectiveness. He moved the executive officer, Richard O'Kane, to the conning tower as approach officer, allowing Morton to remain in the control room where he could oversee the entire boat during attacks. He encouraged initiative among his crew, rewarding creative solutions to tactical problems. And he insisted on aggressive tactics, penetrating escort screens, attacking from close range, pressing home attacks even when depth charges were falling. By November 1943, the Wahoo had completed 5 war patrols and sunk 20 enemy ships, making Morton one of the most successful submarine commanders in the Pacific. But success bred danger. The Japanese knew the Wahoo by reputation if not by name. They had learned to recognize her tactics, to anticipate her movements, and they were determined to sink her. The silent running technique that Morton and his crew perfected went beyond the standard doctrine. It began with understanding how sound propagated underwater. Sonar worked by emitting a pulse of sound and listening for the echo reflected by a target. But sound in water behaves differently than sound in air. It is affected by temperature layers, salinity gradients, and thermal currents. A submarine could hide beneath a thermocline, a boundary between water layers of different temperatures, and the sonar pulses would refract away, bending downward or scattering, reducing the chances of detection. The Wahoo's crew learned to find these thermoclines quickly, diving beneath them and then stopping all movement. Complete stillness. No motors, no pumps, no ventilation fans. The submarine would settle to neutral buoyancy, neither rising nor sinking, drifting with the current like a dead whale. Inside, the crew moved like ghosts. They removed their shoes. They communicated with hand signals or written notes. They sat motionless at their stations, conserving oxygen, minimizing any activity that might generate noise. Even the cook stopped preparing meals. Cold food only eaten in silence. The technique was physically and psychologically exhausting, but it worked. Japanese sonar operators, listening for the sound of motors or propellers or machinery, heard nothing. The Wahoo became invisible, but Morton added an innovation that made the technique truly devastating. While conventional doctrine called for remaining silent until the escorts left, Morton realized that the submarine could use the time underwater not just to hide, but to reposition. By carefully calculating currents and using minimal trim adjustments, the Wahoo could drift silently into a new position, sometimes miles from where the escorts expected her to be. When she finally surfaced hours later to recharge batteries, she would emerge in an entirely different location, often ahead of the convoy she had just attacked, ready to strike again. The Japanese escorts, having lost contact, assumed the submarine had fled the area. They would rejoin the convoy and continue their voyage, unaware that the predator was already repositioning for the next attack. This tactic, attack, go silent, drift to a new position, surface and recharge, attack again, allowed the Wahoo to devastate multiple convoys in rapid succession, appearing seemingly everywhere at once, an unseen phantom that struck and vanished. The emotional contrast at the heart of the story is the collision between Japanese confidence in their convoy system and the reality of the Wahoo's repeated attacks. By late 1943, the Imperial Japanese Navy believed it had achieved a measure of control over submarine threats. Convoy routes were organized, escort procedures standardized, anti-submarine training intensified. Japanese merchant captains, who in 1942 had sailed in terror of American submarines, now felt a degree of reassurance when sailing under escort. The destroyers and corvettes that protected them were experienced, their crews trained in anti-submarine warfare, their equipment proven in combat. When a submarine attacked, the escorts responded with doctrine and discipline, depth charge patterns, sonar searches, coordinated sweeps. And most of the time, it worked. American submarines were forced deep, were damaged, sometimes destroyed. The statistics supported Japanese confidence. Merchant ship losses, while still significant, had declined from the catastrophic rates of 1942. But the Wahoo represented something the Japanese had not anticipated. A submarine that could attack repeatedly, that could not be pinned down or driven off, that vanished and reappeared like a nightmare that refused to end. November 12, 1943. 1,130 hours. The Japanese destroyer Harasame, escorting convoy HI-79 bound for Manila with reinforcements and supplies, has been hunting the American submarine for 7 hours. The destroyer's sonar operator has maintained intermittent contact, but the echoes are weak, inconsistent, sometimes disappearing entirely. The captain, Commander Sato Hideki, is frustrated. His depth charges have been dropped in carefully calculated patterns, more than 60 charges expended, each one a thunderous explosion that should have damaged or destroyed the target. But there is no debris, no oil slick, no evidence of a kill. The submarine, if it is still there, remains hidden. Sato considers the situation. His fuel is running low. The convoy has moved 15 miles ahead and is vulnerable without its full escort complement. And the sonar contact has been lost for 20 minutes. Doctrine requires him to maintain the search for another hour, but he weighs the risk. The submarine, if still alive, is likely damaged, or at minimum has exhausted its battery charge. It will not be able to pursue the convoy. Sato makes the decision that Morton is counting on. He signals the other escort, a corvette that has been assisting the search, and both vessels turn away, increasing speed to rejoin the convoy. They leave behind only the silence of the deep water and the slowly fading echoes of their sonar. 200 feet below, Morton checks his stopwatch. 30 minutes since the last sonar ping. He signals the sonar operator, who listens intently on his hydrophones, then shakes his head. No contacts. The escorts have left. Morton allows himself a thin smile. He waits another 15 minutes, a precaution in case the Japanese double back, then orders the boat brought slowly to periscope depth. The electric motors engage with the softest possible hum, trimming the submarine upward at a rate so gradual it feels like floating. At 60 feet, Morton raises the periscope and makes a quick observation. Empty ocean. No ships, no aircraft. He lowers the scope and orders the Wahoo to surface. Hatches crack open, and the blessed fresh air rushes in, cool and clean, replacing the fetid atmosphere below. Diesel engines roar to life, charging the depleted batteries. The crew, released from the silent tension of the last 7 hours, moves with sudden energy, speaking in normal voices, stretching cramped muscles, gulping water from canteens. Morton climbs to the bridge and scans the horizon with binoculars. To the northwest, barely visible, is the smoke from the convoy, HI-79, 19 merchant ships and 4 escorts, sailing at 9 knots toward Manila. Morton checks his charts and calculates. The Wahoo has drifted south with the current, putting her in a position to intercept the convoy again after dark. He orders the navigator to plot a course, full speed on the surface, to position ahead of the convoy's projected track. The Wahoo, which the Japanese believe is either sunk or driven off, will be waiting. The historical evidence for the Wahoo's actions during this 72-hour period comes from multiple sources. The boat's patrol report filed after her return to Midway, corroborating Japanese records of convoy losses, post-war interviews with surviving crew members, and intercepted Japanese communications decoded by American cryptographers. The patrol report for the Wahoo's 7th War Patrol, covering November 10th to 13th, 1943, lists a devastating sequence of attacks. On November 10th, the Wahoo intercepted Convoy T-203 east of Palawan and sank 3 cargo ships totaling 12,000 tons before being driven off by escorts. After going silent and drifting for 6 hours, the boat surfaced, repositioned, and attacked the same convoy again at dawn on November 11th, sinking 2 more ships totaling 9,000 tons. The escorts, believing they had driven off the submarine the previous evening, were caught unprepared by the renewed attack. On November 12th, the Wahoo located convoy HI-79, the engagement described above, and sank 4 ships totaling 18,000 tons in 2 separate attacks 12 hours apart, using the silent running technique to evade the escorts between strikes. On November 13th, the boat intercepted a smaller convoy, So-14, and sank 3 ships totaling 11,000 tons before Japanese air patrols forced her to break off and retire toward friendly waters. In 72 hours, the Wahoo had attacked 4 different convoys, sinking 16 ships with a combined tonnage of 50,000 tons, using 24 torpedoes with an 80% hit rate. No other American submarine had achieved such concentrated destruction in so short a time. Japanese records confirm the scale of the disaster. The Imperial Japanese Navy's convoy office in Manila reported unprecedented losses during the period of November 10 to 13, 1943, and launched an investigation into the failures of the escort system. Intercepted communications, decoded by American cryptanalysts at Station Hypo in Pearl Harbor, revealed Japanese confusion and alarm. One message, sent from Manila to Tokyo on November 14, stated, "Submarine activity east of Palawan has reached critical levels. Multiple convoys attacked by what appears to be coordinated wolf pack. Escort vessels report depth charge attacks successful but no debris or confirmation. Submarine or submarines continue attacks. Convoy operations temporarily suspended pending reinforcement of escort forces." The Japanese believed they were facing multiple submarines operating in coordination, a wolf pack like those employed by German U-boats in the Atlantic. They did not realize they were facing a single boat that had mastered the art of vanishing and reappearing, of turning silence into a weapon. The symbolic object of this story is the stopwatch, a simple mechanical timepiece that Commander Morton carried throughout his patrols. The stopwatch was used to time everything: the interval between sonar pings, the duration of silent running, the spacing of torpedo salvos, the delay before surfacing after escorts departed. In Morton's hands, the stopwatch became an instrument of precision, a tool that transformed submarine warfare from a game of luck and courage into a science of calculation and patience. It represented the discipline required for silent running, the willingness to wait motionless and silent, while depth charges exploded overhead, while the air grew foul and the crew grew exhausted, while every instinct screamed to move, to do something, to fight or flee. The stopwatch measured the seconds and minutes that meant survival. It also symbolized the relentless pressure of time that the submarine war imposed on both sides. For the submarine crew, time was life. Battery charge draining, oxygen depleting, food and water running low, each patrol a race against the limits of endurance. For the Japanese convoys, time was distance. Every hour sailed was another hour closer to the safety of port, to the anti-submarine nets and air cover that protected the harbors. And for Morton, the stopwatch represented control, the ability to impose his will on the chaos of combat, to choose when to attack and when to disappear, to master time itself. November 12, 1943, 2,145 hours. The Wahoo lies on the surface 15 miles ahead of convoy HI-79, diesel engines running at full power, batteries recharging, crew preparing for another attack. In the conning tower, Morton and O'Kane study the plot. The convoy should pass within 3 miles of the submarine's position in approximately 2 hours, steaming on a predictable course toward Manila. The moon is in its last quarter, providing minimal illumination, ideal conditions for a surface attack. Morton plans to let the convoy pass, then attack from astern, targeting the rear ships while the forward escorts are too distant to respond quickly. After firing, the Wahoo will crash dive and go silent, repeating the technique that worked that morning. The crew is tired, 3 days of continuous operations with minimal rest, but morale is high. They have confidence in their captain, in their boat, in the technique that has kept them alive and made them deadly. At 2,347 hours, the convoy appears on the horizon, a cluster of dark shapes against the starlit water. Morton takes the Wahoo to battle stations submerged, diving to periscope depth to approach undetected. At 0012 hours, he begins the attack, firing 6 torpedoes in a carefully timed spread at 3 overlapping targets. 2 minutes later, explosions light the night. 3 hits, 2 ships sinking, 1 damaged. The escorts erupt in activity. Sirens wailing, searchlights sweeping the water. The Wahoo dives to 200 feet, shuts down all systems, and vanishes. The transformation that occurred as a result of the Wahoo's successes, and the successes of other aggressive submarine commanders who adopted similar tactics, was strategic and psychological. The Japanese merchant marine, already stretched thin by losses, could not sustain the attrition. Convoy schedules were disrupted, routes altered, ships diverted to ports farther from the front lines where they were needed. Critical supplies, fuel, ammunition, food failed to reach Japanese garrisons in the Philippines, New Guinea, and the Solomon Islands, weakening their ability to resist Allied advances. Japanese industry, dependent on imported raw materials, began to suffer shortages. By early 1944, oil shipments from the East Indies had been cut by 40%, copper imports by 60%, iron ore by 30%. The Japanese economy, which had mobilized for total war, began to strangle. But beyond the material impact, the submarine campaign inflicted a psychological toll. Japanese merchant sailors, once confident in their escort protection, now sailed in fear. Morale plummeted. Desertions increased. Ships sat in port for weeks waiting for escorts that were themselves being sunk or damaged by submarines. The Japanese Navy, forced to divert destroyers and aircraft from offensive operations to convoy protection, lost the initiative. The submarine became the weapon that Japan could not counter, the threat that multiplied faster than defenses could be built. The American submarine force, emboldened by the successes of commanders like Morton, adopted increasingly aggressive tactics. Silent running techniques were standardized and taught at submarine schools. New equipment, improved sonar, better torpedoes, quieter motors, gave submarines additional advantages. And the doctrine evolved. Submarines no longer avoided escorts but actively sought out convoys, knowing they could attack, evade, and attack again. The transformation was reflected in the statistics. In 1942, American submarines sank 180 Japanese merchant ships totaling 725,000 tons. In 1943, that number rose to 284 ships totaling 1.3 million tons. And in 1944, the peak year of the submarine campaign, American boats sank 492 ships totaling 2.4 million tons. The Wahoo's 72-hour rampage in November 1943 was a microcosm of this larger campaign, a demonstration that the submarine, properly employed, could dominate the sea lanes and strangle an island nation dependent on maritime commerce. November 13, 1943. The Wahoo surfaces at dawn after another night of silent running. Morton surveys the horizon and sees nothing. The convoy, or what remains of it, has scattered. Some ships have fled back toward Palawan. Others have made for the nearest port. Others simply steaming at maximum speed in random directions, hoping to outrun the invisible predator. The escorts are nowhere to be seen, likely accompanying the surviving ships or searching in the wrong area. Morton orders a course change, heading northeast toward the shipping lanes between Luzon and Formosa, where intelligence reports indicate another convoy is transiting. The crew is exhausted, running on adrenaline and caffeine, but there is no question of breaking off the patrol. There are still 12 torpedoes in the tubes and magazines, and Morton intends to expend every one. At 1,600 hours, the Wahoo encounters Convoy So-14, a smaller formation of 6 merchant ships and 2 escorts. Morton attacks at dusk, firing his remaining torpedoes in 2 rapid salvos, sinking 3 ships and damaging a 4th. The escorts counterattack furiously, and this time they nearly succeed. Depth charges bracket the Wahoo, close enough that light bulbs shatter, gauges crack, and the crew is thrown against bulkheads. But the hull holds, and Morton takes the boat deeper to 400 feet, beyond the maximum rated depth, into water so deep the pressure hull groans audibly. He waits. 1 hour. 2 hours. The depth charges continue, but they are falling shallow now, the escorts having lost contact. At 2,300 hours, the attacks cease. Morton waits another hour, then cautiously brings the boat to periscope depth. Empty ocean. He surfaces, starts the engines, and sets course for Midway. The 7th War Patrol is over. The USS Wahoo returned to Midway on November 21, 1943, after one of the most successful patrols in submarine warfare history. Morton and his crew were greeted as heroes. The patrol report was classified and distributed to all submarine commands as a tactical study. The silent running technique, refined and proven by the Wahoo, was incorporated into standard operating procedure. But the triumph was shadowed by exhaustion and loss. The crew, pushed to their physical and psychological limits, needed weeks of rest. The boat itself required extensive repairs, hull damage from depth charges, worn machinery, depleted supplies. Morton was awarded the Navy Cross, his third, and promoted to full commander. He was offered a staff position, a chance to leave the danger of patrol duty and serve in a training or administrative role. He declined. The Wahoo was his command, and he intended to sail her until the war was won. The tragedy came on the 8th War Patrol. In October 1944, the Wahoo departed Pearl Harbor for the Sea of Japan, the most dangerous waters in the Pacific, close to the Japanese home islands, heavily patrolled, mined, and protected by extensive anti-submarine defenses. Morton intended to prove that, even there, American submarines could operate with impunity. The Wahoo entered the Sea of Japan through La Perouse Strait in early November and began attacking shipping. On November 11, 1944, exactly 1 year after the 72-hour rampage described in this narrative, the Wahoo was detected by Japanese anti-submarine forces while transiting the shallow waters of the Tsugaru Strait. Multiple escorts converged on her position. Depth charges fell in saturation patterns. The Wahoo attempted her silent running technique, but the water was too shallow to hide, too confined to maneuver. For hours, the attacks continued. And then silence. The Wahoo did not respond to radio calls. She did not return to Pearl Harbor. All 79 men aboard, including Commander Dudley Morton, were lost. Japanese records, discovered after the war, confirmed that a submarine matching the Wahoo's description was sunk in the Tsugaru Strait on November 11, 1944, with no survivors. Morton's stopwatch, the instrument that had measured so many successful attacks, stopped ticking somewhere beneath the cold waters of northern Japan. The epilogue of this story must reckon with both triumph and tragedy, with the extraordinary success of the 72-hour period in November 1943 and the ultimate fate of the Wahoo and her crew. The silent running technique that Morton perfected became a standard element of American submarine warfare, used by hundreds of boats throughout the remainder of the war. It saved countless lives by allowing submarines to evade detection, and it multiplied the effectiveness of the submarine force by enabling repeated attacks on the same convoy. The technique embodied a fundamental principle of submarine warfare: that invisibility is power, that the ability to strike and vanish is more valuable than armor or heavy guns, that patience and discipline can overcome superior numbers. The stopwatch, that simple timepiece, became the symbol of this principle, a reminder that victory is often a matter of waiting for the right moment, of enduring discomfort and danger in silence, of trusting in technique and training even when instinct demands action. But the story also illustrates the limits of technique, the reality that even the most skilled commanders and the most effective tactics cannot guarantee survival in war. Morton pushed the boundaries of submarine operations, venturing into waters where others feared to go, attacking with an aggressiveness that bordered on recklessness. His successes made him a legend, but they also made him a target. The Japanese, humiliated by the losses inflicted by the Wahoo and other American submarines, intensified their anti-submarine efforts. They deployed more escorts, improved their sonar and depth charge tactics, mined critical straits, and established air patrols over shipping lanes. The Sea of Japan, where Morton took the Wahoo on her final patrol, became a death trap. Several American submarines were lost there, their crews unable to escape the combined weight of Japanese defenses. Morton's confidence, justified by so many successful patrols, led him into a situation where even his skill and his boat's capabilities were insufficient. The stopwatch that had measured his victories also measured his final hours, counting down the seconds until the depth charges found their mark and the Wahoo slipped beneath the waves for the last time. The larger truth that emerges from this story is about the nature of asymmetric warfare and the power of innovation in the face of material disadvantage. The American submarine force in 1943 was small compared to the vast scale of Japanese merchant shipping and naval escorts. Individual submarines could not match Japanese destroyers in surface combat and were vulnerable to depth charges when submerged. The conventional approach, surfacing to attack and then fleeing at high speed, resulted in high losses and limited effectiveness. Morton and other innovative commanders recognized that submarines needed to operate differently, to exploit their unique capabilities rather than trying to fight like surface ships. The silent running technique was an innovation born of necessity, a tactical solution to the problem of how to survive anti-submarine attacks and remain in position to strike again. It required discipline, training, and courage, qualities that the American submarine force possessed in abundance. And it worked. The Japanese, despite their numerical superiority and their control of the waters around their home islands, could not stop the submarines that mastered silent running. The wolf could not be found if the wolf did not move, did not breathe, did not make a sound. The stopwatch, in this context, represents more than just a timing device. It represents the American approach to war. Pragmatic, technical, focused on solving problems through innovation rather than through adherence to doctrine. Japanese anti-submarine warfare was methodical and disciplined, following established procedures for searching and attacking submerged submarines. But those procedures assumed that the submarine would behave in predictable ways, that it would attempt to flee the area, that it would make noise, that it could be tracked and destroyed with sufficient persistence. The silent running technique broke those assumptions. By going completely still, by drifting with the current, by repositioning during the silent period, the Wahoo and other submarines employing the tactic created a situation the Japanese doctrine could not handle. The escorts would search the area where they expected the submarine to be and find nothing. Meanwhile, the submarine was already miles away, preparing for the next attack. The stopwatch measured that gap, the gap between Japanese expectation and American innovation, between what the doctrine said should happen and what actually did happen. December 1943, 1 month after the Wahoo's triumphant return from her 7th patrol, the submarine force held a conference at Pearl Harbor to discuss tactics and lessons learned. Morton was invited to present his experiences, and he brought his stopwatch with him. He described the silent running technique in detail, how to find thermoclines, how to achieve neutral buoyancy, how to minimize noise, how to drift with currents to reposition. He demonstrated the stopwatch, explaining how he timed sonar pings to estimate the escort's search patterns, how he waited specific intervals before surfacing to ensure the coast was clear. The officers attending the conference listened intently, took notes, asked questions. Some were skeptical. The technique required extraordinary discipline and nerve, and not every crew was capable of maintaining absolute silence for hours on end. But others recognized the potential. Within weeks, the silent running technique was being taught at submarine schools, practiced in training exercises, and implemented across the Pacific Fleet. The stopwatch became standard equipment, issued to every submarine commander along with charts, code books, and firing tables. And in the months that followed, Japanese convoy losses mounted, as more and more American submarines adopted the tactics that Morton had pioneered. The final reflection must address what the stopwatch and the silent running technique represent in the larger narrative of World War II and the ideological struggle it embodied. The war was fought between systems, authoritarian regimes that valued obedience and discipline, and democracies that valued initiative and innovation. The Japanese military system was hierarchical, rigid, bound by tradition and doctrine. It produced disciplined soldiers and sailors who followed orders and executed established procedures with precision. But it did not encourage improvisation or reward individual initiative. The American military system, for all its own hierarchies and regulations, was more flexible, more willing to adopt new ideas from junior officers, more open to experimental tactics that violated conventional wisdom. Morton was a lieutenant commander, not an admiral, when he developed the silent running technique. He did so through trial and error, without authorization from higher command, sometimes in violation of doctrine. And when his technique proved successful, it was adopted not because he had high rank or political influence, but because it worked. The stopwatch in Morton's hands became a symbol of this innovation, a tool that any officer could use, a technique that any crew could learn, a tactical advantage that did not depend on superior technology or greater resources, but on ingenuity and determination. The contrast with the Japanese approach is instructive. Japanese anti-submarine warfare in 1943 was based on established doctrine developed before the war and refined through early combat experience. It was effective against submarines that behaved in predictable ways, attacking on the surface, fleeing at high speed, making noise that sonar could detect. But when American submarines began employing silent running and drifting repositioning, Japanese tactics did not adapt quickly enough. Escort commanders continued to follow standard search patterns, continued to assume that depth charges would force the submarine to surface or betray its position, continued to believe that their doctrine was adequate. The Japanese Navy did eventually develop improved anti-submarine tactics, better sonar, acoustic homing torpedoes, coordinated air and surface searches. But these improvements came late in the war, after the submarine campaign had already crippled Japanese logistics. The stopwatch, ticking away the seconds in Morton's hand, measured the gap between recognition and response, the time it took for a rigid system to adapt to a changing threat. And in that gap, American submarines sank thousands of ships and strangled the Japanese war effort. The story of the Wahoo's 72-hour rampage and the silent running technique that made it possible is, in the end, a story about the power of patience in an impatient war, about the strength of silence in a conflict defined by noise and violence, about the triumph of careful calculation over brute force. Morton and his crew did not win their victories through superior firepower or technological advantage. They won by disappearing, by becoming invisible and inaudible, by turning the ocean itself into a hiding place. The stopwatch, that simple mechanical device, was the key to this invisibility. It measured the intervals of danger and safety, the moments when the enemy was close and the moments when he had given up and moved on. It disciplined the natural impulse to act, to move, to fight, replacing it with the harder discipline of stillness and silence. And in doing so, it transformed the submarine from a visible raider into an invisible phantom, from a target to be hunted into a hunter that could not be found. The stopwatch that Commander Morton carried on that November patrol in 1943, the instrument that timed depth charge intervals and sonar pings, that measured the agonizing minutes of silent running while the crew barely breathed and the destroyer circled overhead, that stopwatch now rests at the bottom of the Tsugaru Strait, along with Morton and 78 brave men who followed him into the darkness. It stopped ticking on November 11, 1944, marking the end of one of the most remarkable careers in submarine warfare history. But the technique Morton perfected lived on, used by American submarines for the remainder of the war, contributing to the destruction of the Japanese merchant marine and the ultimate Allied victory. The stopwatch, silent now beneath the cold Pacific waters, remains a symbol of the moment when silence became a weapon, when patience became power, when one submarine's ability to vanish and reappear allowed it to sink 4 convoys in 72 hours and strike terror into the heart of an empire. The ticking has stopped, but the lesson endures. That in war, as in life, there is power in stillness, strength in silence, and victory in the discipline to wait for exactly the right moment to strike.